Okay, welcome everybody to our online hot politics lab, which due to the lockdown has forced us to move from physical meetings on Friday at the University of Amsterdam to online meetings on Zoom. But the big benefit has been that we've been able to invite a lot of people who would normally not be so close to us and be able to just drop by. And today we have again speakers who are from quite far away. The Hot Politics Lab is a lab that dwells upon political psychology to study both elites and citizens and try to understand what drives them. We're an interdisciplinary group with people from communication science, political science, both more senior and more junior people. And if you want to know more about the lab, please check out our website, which is hotpolitics.eu, where you can see some of our ongoing work and some of our published work. I give the floor to Gijs Schumacher, who will introduce the speakers for today.
Thank you, Bert. And I have the privilege today to introduce not one, but two speakers. We're getting really cocky now. We think it's working well with one speaker. Let's try two speakers now. Good morning to our speakers, Chris Karpowitz and Joshua Gubler, who are based at Brigham Young University, which is in Provo, Utah. So it's about 8 in the morning now for you guys? Yeah. Okay, so
yeah,
you take your breakfast. We're about to open the beer here, but I'm really happy to have Chris and Josh here today. They will give a talk about mixed affective states, which is, I think, a situation we're all in currently. Feeling, from speaking for myself, a little bit happy that my kids can go to school again in 2 weeks, which at least half the week. But still, of course, quite anxious to learn how this will all work out in the Netherlands. To briefly introduce Chris and Josh, they're at Brigham Young University. They're both associate professors. They both work in the area of political psychology, and they have been applying this to a whole range of topics. So, for example, Chris has published several things on religious norms and movements, on gender, and Josh has published several articles on intergroup cooperation and conflict. And so I'm really happy to have them here. Really looking forward to their talk. Without further delays, I will yield the virtual space to Chris and Josh.
Thanks so much, Gijs. And Bert, we're just delighted to be here today. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can get started here. We, as you've indicated, have been thinking about this notion of mixed affective states and how that relates to political persuasion, which is something that we've been interested in. In fact, our work begins with a puzzle that emerged from some attempts to explore empathy. In this work on empathy, we noticed that observationally, at least, various emotions correlated with distinct attitudes and behaviors. There's a lot of evidence to that effect: anger, fear, disgust, excitement. Our focus was empathy. There's a correlation between empathy and certain sorts of political attitudes. And yet, when we look at the experimental work, that work consistently shows that the generated emotion, that is via the experiment, we can generate a great deal of emotion, but it often has very little effect on changing attitudes. That was certainly true of our work with empathy, but we found as we explored a little more that we're not the only ones, and that other people who have focused on prejudice reduction, for example, Clara Dita or Betsy Pollack, find that they can move emotions, sometimes in dramatic ways, without having any subsequent effect on political attitudes, or if there is an effect, it's very small and it evaporates quickly. So why might that be? There are a variety of different possibilities. Could be that affect is just the wrong mechanism for producing attitude change, that attitude change is cognitive in some sense. Could be a problem with the treatments, either they're weak and messy, or they work but only very briefly, and so they decay rapidly. Alternatively, it could be a measurement problem, that if our measures of emotions were better, or if our measures of political outcomes were better, we would see the change that we were looking for. We think all of those are possible and important explanations. All of them should be pursued. But we're going to focus on a sixth possibility that we're calling mixed affective states. And the idea here is that political messages often create in those who receive those messages multiple and conflicting emotions. You may have seen this picture that has been circulating widely in the United States, at least. It's of a protest event that occurred in Denver, Colorado, here in the United States just a few days ago. And the protester is reacting against the stay-at-home orders in the state of Colorado, and is in her truck protesting and asking for those orders to be lifted. You can also see the doctor who is literally meeting them in the streets and representing a different point of view about these stay-at-home orders. And as you look at this picture, you might feel a mix of emotions, right? You might be, for example, frustrated or angry even with the protester, and feel concern or empathy for the doctor. Alternatively, if you're part of the protest group, you might feel the opposite: concern or empathy for the protester, and frustration and annoyance with the doctor. In any case, we think that these sorts of mixed affective states are common reactions to political images and messages that individuals might receive. And so that leads us to think in a broader sense about the relationship between affect and emotion.
Great.
Josh is going to talk a little bit about that.
So as Chris has begun by talking particularly about discrete emotions, we're going to move away from discrete emotions and use them as proxies to talk about something a little more basic and essential to human attitudes and behaviors, and that's affect. Now, like neuroscientists and others, we're going to define affect as the brain's interpretation of the somatic, physical changes that occur in the body in connection to stimuli. This affect is basic sensation. It's characterized by valence, pleasant and unpleasant, no distinctions per se within those, and arousal, high versus low. Now, affect is generated as the brain takes past memory associations and concepts that it's created over time, ideas, objects, people, types of people, emotions, etc. And emotions, we conceive of them as memory concepts. We can talk in the Q&A about that distinction between that and affect. As the brain takes these objects, these memory concepts, to predict current body resource needs. So for example, if my brain sees an apple because I have that concept stored in my memory, and I approach it for consumption, the body resource need is a little extra insulin and so on and so forth. If my brain sees an ideological opponent, then the prediction from that, from past experience, might mean a little extra cortisol. Whatever it is, those changes generate affect. And we care about affect because our interpretations of affect motivate attitudes and behavior. And this is widely known in both political and social psychology. They generate, to borrow the action tendencies framework language, affect generates action tendencies. Approach, avoid, accept, reject. Now, previous research in political science has focused a lot on pleasant and unpleasant affect, right? And how that sends clear signals to approach, avoid, reject, or so on and so forth. We think of the excellent work of Lodge and Tabor and Redlosk and a bunch in the motivated reasoning paradigm, for example. However, we suggest that recent findings in neuroscience and other places suggest that valence is orthogonal, pleasant and unpleasant. And if so, when you combine it with arousal, this implies a 4-quadrant latent affective space. We illustrate that here in the affective quadruplex. You can see in the upper left and bottom right corners the pleasant affective and unpleasant affective states. These are characterized by individuals with high arousal from pleasant valence or unpleasant valence. And you can see that we've mapped it onto motivation. People in pleasant or unpleasant should respond to a treatment, a message, with short-term attitude change. Now, the other two states, however, are states that have been pretty much entirely neglected, except for work by Jeff Larson and others in social psychology. We call these states on the we call them states on the neglected diagonal. First of these is a weak affective state in the bottom left. These are people who, for whatever reason, you hit them with a message, and it's just not relevant to them. There's not a lot of arousal. Could be because they don't have the relevant objects or concepts in their brain, or the prediction is, hey, that's just not important to me. That doesn't affect what I need to do. But the upper right-hand corner state, this mixed affective state, is the real focus of our talk today. This is a state that we think is characterized by individuals who are experiencing high levels of feeling of affect, but it's from both pleasant and unpleasant valence. And for people in this state experience strong feeling, but here the signals for action are mixed. They're in a mixed motivational state. And the key insight here is that people in this state, as people in the weak affective state, we expect not to exhibit attitudinal change. And it's not because we didn't create high levels of feeling, it's because the signals are not clear. Now, we think the fundamental challenge of persuasion is that attempts to persuade often of necessity activate both unpleasant and pleasant valence, leaving people in a mixed affective state and thus a mixed motivational state. If you have high anti-immigrant feeling, and when I mention the word immigrant, up comes a bunch of unpleasant affect, and then I hit you with some sort of a persuasive message designed to generate a lot of pleasant valence, to reassociate. What I end up doing in most cases, we think, is simply putting you into a mixed affective state, which is, we think, the key to understanding the puzzle of how you can generate high feeling and low attitudinal change response. We think for this reason, mixed affect is worth foregrounding, just like cognitive ambivalence was in the Zoll and Hochschild case.
So we're going to explore this with the help of 5 studies. These studies were undertaken by different teams of researchers in different locations with different goals in mind. 2 of them are our own studies on empathy in the UK context, but we've also been generously given access to other data sets as well. George Marcus, we use a study from 2017 from his group. Shayna Gadarian, from whom you heard last week, generously shared data with us, and we're also indebted to Mike Neblo and his team. And all of these studies, again, undertaken with different goals in mind, include a treatment designed to persuade. Treatments are of differing strength, as we'll see. Some of them are relatively weak treatments or very simple and pretty straightforward. Others are quite powerful. The Politics with the People study involves direct contact with members of Congress, which we think is a very powerful treatment. So all of them include treatments of various kinds, and then post-treatment measures of discrete emotions that are measured with a Likert scale that allows us to capture some level of arousal with respect to each of those emotions. But as Josh said, we distinguish between discrete emotions and these latent affective states. We're going to start with the discrete emotions and see how they cluster together. And do they cluster together in essentially a two-dimensional pattern? That's our hypothesis. We use factor analysis and principal component analyses to do this, and we examine the robustness of our approach with multiple different factoring methods. So one initial question is, do these discrete emotions cluster together in essentially two dimensions? And we test that in a variety of ways. One simple way is, as the name indicates, the very simple structure fit, which is maximized. It peaks when the goodness of fit of the factor solution is maximized. And this tends to be the optimal number of interpretable factors. And you can see that across all 5 studies, the very simple structure fit peaks at 2 dimensions, peaks very clearly at 2 dimensions. We did other tests as well. We're happy to talk about those in the Q&A, and they all indicate, by and large, they all indicate essentially 2 factors. Now, how are those factors organized? Here we look at biplots. This is from a principal components analysis. The gray points in each of these figures are the actual observations in each of the studies. And the blue arrows are essentially the factor loadings. And you can see that these variables are clearly organized in 2 separate and orthogonal factors. There is one that we might call a pleasant valenced factor. That's things like words, emotions like hope and enthusiasm and pride. And then there's a kind of unpleasant factor, which is things like fear and anger, being uneasy, worried, or sad. The exact words that are used vary from study to study, although there's some overlap, but clearly across all 5 studies, we get a very noticeable pattern. And I should just add that our method does not require or assume or produce in any way necessarily this orthogonal pattern. This is just the pattern that emerges clearly across the 5 studies. Now, then our hypothesis is that many participants in these studies will end up in a mixed affective state. And how do we address that? Well, we essentially follow the cut points produced by the factor analysis in those 2 dimensions to produce the 4 different quadrants that Josh talked about earlier. We've got pleasant valence, unpleasant, weak, and mixed. And you can see, this is from the Gubler et al. Refugee study, that a large number of participants ended up in the mixed and weak conditions. And you might say, well, that might depend on the features of the exact procedures that you followed for the factor analysis. And we agree with that. That's true. So we did a kind of sensitivity analysis where we reran it 7 different ways. And that's the figure on the right. And you can see that in the vast majority of cases, the observations in green end up in the same quadrant no matter what factoring solution we use. There are a few cases right on the border between the cut points that in one factoring solution or the other move one way or the other, but that's a small number of cases. And we see this same pattern in all 5 studies. In all 5 studies, significant proportions of participants in the study end up in weak or mixed affective states. Often that's about half the participants. Even when the treatments are the strongest, as in the Neblo et al. Study, we still get 1/3 of participants in weak or mixed affective states.
Now, in the few minutes we have left, we want to talk about why we think affect matters. And to do that, we want to start first with a construct validity test of the theory generally. The theory suggests that affect matters because of the action tendencies that relate to motivation, and that people in pleasant and unpleasant are going to have strong support for or antipathy towards the target of that affect, right? And that people in a weak and mixed state are going to be kind of somewhere in the middle. So what we do is to test that, we look at some post-treatment correlations. This table shows, and I wish we had more time to talk through this, we encourage you to read the paper, but this table shows for all 5 studies the treatment, which generally attempted in all of these studies to generate affect towards a target. In most cases, it was refugees, migrants, immigrants. One case, it's a member of Congress. And then what we do is we measure post-treatment affect with putting people into those 4 states, the measure that Chris just showed you. And we correlate those states with dependent variables that are support for policies or opposition to policies that help or harm the target, right? And we have predictions here, right? In the Gubler et al., for example, we expect that people who experienced who experienced high degrees of pleasant affect, for example, should show low support for policies that harm migrants, and the opposite for unpleasant. So if we flip to the next slide here, this shows those post-treatment correlations. This isn't a causal analysis in any way. But what's striking here is it is exactly the pattern predicted by the theory. People who have the strongest support or aversion to those policies, whether they're in pleasant and unpleasant states, they're the endpoints just as the theory would predict. And in all of these studies, you see people in weak and mixed affective states right in the middle. If we were to map the control line here, and maybe we need to do that actually in the final version of this paper, you would see that they're indistinguishable from the control, and it's only people who are in pleasant and unpleasant who are distinguishable on either end of the spectrum. This is true in all of the studies, and we think that that's a fascinating construct validity confirmation of the theory. If we had more time, we would talk a little bit about how we think an advantage of using affect rather than discrete emotions is that it allows us to focus on what's really motivating people at the basic level rather than having to parse emotion words. One of the fascinating things, for example, is that we try to generate empathy in our studies, the 2 studies you see at the top. Shana and Nathan are trying to generate empathy as well, but when we say empathy, we're trying to generate pleasant affect, and they're trying to generate unpleasant affect. We think that rather than trying to parse different discrete emotion words and use them differently, it's just simpler to look at affect. And you see the reverse pattern for them. Now, another reason why focusing on affect is beneficial is because it helps us explain the lack of treatment effects. It goes back to that puzzle with which we started. So as Chris showed you in the previous table, we have 4 of the 5 studies show roughly 50% of all participants in weak or mixed affective states. And we would expect in those 4 studies shown here that when we do just a standard average treatment effects causal analysis, we'd expect no average treatment effect, because you mix, all of those people in weak and mixed in with the pleasant and unpleasant, that ends up at about 0. And that's what these coefficients show here, right? No average treatment effects, even though we generated a high degree of feeling among these people. And that can be seen in the final table that we'll show you here, which is a table that shows you, it calculates estimated numbers of people moving in and out of these latent affective states in response to the treatment. As you can see, for example, Shana's study with Nathan, this is the bottom study in this table, is an exceptionally powerful study. We have a net percentage change of 50% out of pleasant and into unpleasant. Why no net average treatment effects? Because you also have a significant number of people in mixed. And moving people out of mixed, as we discuss in the paper, is an awfully difficult thing. This goes back to the fundamental challenge of persuasion. If we had more time, we'd show you more on this table here, but let's conclude, and then we'll take a few questions for the remainder of the hour. So what we've argued here is just as ambivalence is a central feature of political cognition, we think mixed affective states are a central feature of the emotional world. The citizens in a political experience, political world experience. And, you know, we really think that cognitive ambivalence is actually a product of mixed affective states, although that's something we can't prove here in this paper just yet. So they're not noise, but they're common and an important response to the political world. And we think that focusing on affect helps us unlock the fundamental challenge of persuasion. It shows that we can generate strong feelings, but little attitude change, and it tells us why, at least one strong reason why. And in the question and answer, we can talk a little bit more about how it sheds light on a series of questions we might ask then to make our persuasive attempts a little more persuasive, right? It highlights some of the determinants of persuasion. The question and answer, we'd love to talk about this last point, but we're out of time here at present, which is that we also think that this has distinct measurement benefits, a focus on affect versus distinct emotion. It requires less emotional intelligence and emotional awareness of participants, and gets us closer to the heart of motivation, which we think is a real advantage. We'll end there, thanking Burton Pais once again for the opportunity to present here, and we look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you, Josh and Chris, for this excellent presentation. It's right up our alley. I want to just highlight for the people listening in that if you have a question for Josh and Chris, you can use the Q&A button below your screen, and you can just type your question, and then I will read it out, and Josh and Chris will hopefully answer. So there is already a first question from Amanda Friesen from Indiana University, who was a visitor at the Hall Politics Lab prior to the COVID-19 crisis. And so she thanks you for the presentation, and she says, I'm curious about the relationship between ideological strength and political interest with affective states. So she wonders, are we just measuring people's priors?
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. That's a great question. Great to hear from you. One of the things that we think is important to do out of this initial effort to explore mixed affective states is to find out more about who is more or less likely to end up in those mixed affective states. Right? And so that's really the next item on our to-do list. We've spent a lot of time over the last year thinking about how to measure mixed affective states and whether we actually, we've tried a number of different ways. Bert and Pais have seen previous iterations of this where we've explored different ways of doing it. And so, so is this just people who are more ideologically committed to certain views? It's possible, right? We do think that the people who are most likely to end up in mixed affective, or at least one group that is very likely to end up there, are people who have very strong affect going in. We saw this in our empathy work, the people with the strongest anti-immigrant attitudes. We could create some empathy in that group. It was harder to do relative to other groups. We could do it, but it really resulted in zero attitude change at all. So The short answer to the question is we need to do more to figure out who exactly is ending up in these different affective states, and that's on our agenda to do. But the evidence we have so far is, yes, there are different groups for whom they're either more likely to end up in mixed affective states, or it's harder to get them. They were in mixed affective states to begin with, and it's harder to get them out. Josh, what would you add to that?
Well, yeah, I think Chris is right on here. I think what we're essentially arguing here is that this is a function of the concepts that people hold in their heads. And ideally, there would be some perfect way to pull out those concepts that wasn't related to or subject to problems of social desirability bias and a whole host of other things. If we could do that, then we could perfectly predict the affect that would result, and then we could design these perfectly put together persuasive messages, right? The trick is identifying those concepts in people's heads, or groups or types of concepts, and that's, as Chris said, what we're trying to work on. We have another paper under review where we have one pre-treatment measure that we try to use to do that. We have mixed results with that. We're sure there are personality characteristics and other things that come into play here as well. And we'd love to, it's just an open question for future research.
All right, thanks a lot. The next question is from Simon Heidlinger. Thank you for the interesting talk. I have two questions. First of all, do you have any links what produces the effect in the first place, considering that the effect may be different in some groups? And second, do you have data that enforcing the opinion of people by giving a contrast emotion than usual has any success? In other words, if in one group one topic is only linked with unpleasant effects, talking to that group in a pleasant way about the topic with the same result leads to stronger or weaker opinion.
Yeah, so I mean, these are just fantastic questions, and they highlight where we're going with our next pieces of research. Right. To take the second question first, I mean, your insight is spot on. It's saying if we could identify groups of people, as I understand it, let's make sure I get the question right, but it seems like the question is, if we could identify groups of people who have just largely pleasant or unpleasant, then the most persuasive type of a message would be to just kind of build on that and not activate the opposite valence message. And we agree with that. The trick is that persuasion is often trying to move people cross-diagonal from unpleasant to pleasant. That we think is the tricky part. We'd be interested in further communication and thoughts on how best to do that. But I guess I would say in response to that question, I think that's exactly the right insight, and that's where we're going. In terms of that first question, do we have any links about what produces affect in the first place? Our paper is full of references citing people from neuroscience and social psychology and other places that provide clear evidence of that. I don't know, Chris, if you want to add something to that.
Yeah, so just a thought about the second question again. So as Josh indicates, as we've played around with various ways of measuring the movement with our existing studies, we think we need additional and new experiments that would get exactly at this question. What we can see so far is it seems to be really hard to move someone who, say, is in the pleasant quadrant into the unpleasant quadrant, purely unpleasant quadrant. What you can do is move them into mixed, right? So they don't give up those pleasant associations, and now they adopt some unpleasant ones. And then they're in mixed, and then they're in this mixed motivational state, as Josh has explained. So could we move them by simply thinking about the emotion that they're already feeling, right? or the affective state they're already in, more precisely in the way we're talking about that, and just emphasizing that, but giving that affect a different connection. Maybe that's not something we've done so far, but it's certainly a very creative and helpful idea. I like that idea in terms of next steps. We're really, as Josh has indicated, we're really at this stage of thinking, okay, we think we're at least for ourselves persuaded that mixed affect occurs, and how can we isolate it a little more, and what are the persuasive messages that would actually work? As Josh indicated at the end of the talk, we think this is at least revealing some level of some of the mechanism there in a clearer way than just focusing on the discrete emotion.
Great, thanks. The next question is from Sanne van Oosten, University of Amsterdam. Thank you for the talk. And she wonders if gender correlates with a tendency towards having mixed affective states. And do you have any ideas or speculations about how that might differ across the gender?
Yeah, that's a great question. We haven't looked as closely at gender, although I think there are interesting reasons to do so. I think this is really our next step, is to think about who's more or less likely to end up in mixed states. What we've looked at mostly is pre-treatment attitudes, and we certainly do find that that the strength of your pre-treatment attitudes matters a great deal. Now, what would be interesting, what we want to do more of is think about people who start in mixed, and who is more or less likely to start in a mixed affective state, and can you move them purely to pleasant or unpleasant? Josh, what else?
Let me add to this. So I did some initial research on this, some initial exploration on this, a couple of years ago when we were first starting to look at these results. We were using a slightly different framework then, and we did see a gender effect, right? And we haven't looked at it with these last 5 data sets, but the initial results would not be surprising, I think. The initial correlations I observed were not super surprising, I think, to scholars of gender, which is that women would be females were more likely to experience mixed affective states than males. And but that is something that those were early results. I haven't looked at that in a couple of years. That would be something that would be fascinating and easy to do, and we really should do that. It's an excellent suggestion.
Next question is from Michael Homan, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Amsterdam and in our Hot Politics lab. She thanks you for the great talk, really interesting work. She wonders what you would pick up when it comes to mixed effect with physiological measurements such as skin conductance and facial EMG.
Yeah, this is a great question, and we've thought a lot about this. And I think this gets back to some extent to our theory of affect. Josh, do you want to talk about this a little bit, because we've had a number of conversations where we've thought about the work that you're doing in the Hot Politics lab on these physiological measures as well.
Right, and I would love to hear from Burton Pais actually on this, who I think are more qualified. I can say that we conducted some experiments. We were initially doing some work on cognitive dissonance, which is kind of a precursor to our move to mixed affective states. In that framework, we conducted a joint skin conductance experiment with Stanley Feldman and Leonie Huddy, and we don't have final results from that, but it just seemed really pretty wildly messy. we think that's because and I, like I said, I'd be interested to hear others' thoughts on this. But affect is, we think, a little more basic than emotion, and I think there's some good evidence from Hot Politics and other people showing that we can pick up with facial recognition emotions to some degree or another, although I think there's a lot of noise there. But emotion is different from affect. It's a context-dependent interpretation in the moment. It's like a memory concept, and so we would love to explore whether you could use facial EMG, for example, to just capture pleasant versus unpleasant without, and maybe there would be a little less noise there. I don't know. I'm really fascinated by the thought of trying something out like this. But in general, we found very little luck with GSR, and I don't think that the skin response is really the way to go. I think there is some promise with facial EMG. We'd love to work with people who know better, if there is indeed promise, looking at that. So that's, I guess, where I would end on that comment.
Can I just add one thing, Josh? Bert and Gijs are the two who should really say more about this. But so on the GSR, it is messy, and to us, it's messy because it's just picking up arousal, but it's not picking up the valence of that arousal, and so it's hard to tell what's going on there. And then the other broader theoretical point that I would make is affect always requires interpretation. And it's possible. So the distinction between our empathy studies and Shayna's empathy studies is instructive here, right? So we were trying to create empathy by which we had in mind, although we didn't conceive of it this way when we first designed the studies, as pleasant affect, right? We were trying to get people to feel pleasant affect towards immigrants. Shayna was also trying to generate empathy, but she did it in exactly the opposite way, which was to try to generate unpleasant affect, right? Something is wrong. I should be worried or anxious or concerned about this group in a way that leads me to greater care for them. So in saying there's mixed affect, right? There's always, whether it's mixed or pure affective states, there's always this step of interpretation. And we think that is partly why physiological measures are sometimes challenging, right? Because the individual always has to interpret what's going on. But we've said too much. We should hear from Bert on this,
Yeah, I'm interested in your thoughts on this from the two of you here.
Yeah, okay, so without Gijs and I, we should probably do a talk on our affect again at some point, but a couple of brief thoughts here. One, what I really like about the paper and the project as it develops is that compared to other people in the field, you have taken a pretty critical approach to say, well, what can we do with these measures of discrete emotions? And I think that's good, because partly where the discussion is starting to arrive at is, well, is self-report more valid than physiology? And I think that's not the discussion we should be having. I like your take in that sense a lot better. It's well, we need to evaluate both critical and to think about the theories. One thing that we are really interested in, and this work that Gijs and I are doing, and Finn Arsenault is also involved in that, is trying to see when maybe physiology would align with what you say you experience. And this comes back a little bit to Chris's interpretation point. So when people experience, say, corrugator activity, and when people are indeed also saying that they experience negative effect, is that the moment when we would see more counter-arguing, we see stronger responses. And the same, so you could think again on the diagonals, so in sort of alignment and disalignment. So when people say they're experiencing negative effect but have no corrugator activity, or just have corrugator activity and say there's nothing going on. That's the line that we are exploring, and I think, but so I think that the physiology is a useful tool here, but I think we also have to be careful and carefully evaluate what it's picking up. And I think they're also carefully thinking about the stimulus material and what you're showing to people is probably going to be important, especially for GSR, Chris. And this is just a couple of us, but if we carefully design our stimuli, then the arousal could still be meaningful in the sense of if we know it's clearly negative, then the increase in skin conductance is probably in response to negative affect. But this is really hard. And I think the third point, and this is something that we have been pushing, is that probably for physiology, well-powered pre-registered studies is probably what we should be doing. And quite a few people are now doing this, but we're small and lab studies with a lot of researcher degrees of freedom are tricky. So I think pre-registering how you analyze and well-powering these studies are going to be crucial, especially for the physiology. Like with the thousands of observations you have here, that's less of an issue. Guys, you want to add something to these random thoughts?
Another random thought maybe. First of all, Chris, Josh, thanks for the great presentation. I agree with Bert that this is really the way to go. And so one comment I had to the paper, and that also aligns a bit with what Bert was saying, is that do we really expect mixed affective states to be sort of in the middle of unpleasant and pleasant? Or because I can see situations, and then I'm thinking, for example, about political rallies where you can see a lot of emotions in the audience, and there you see, in terms of the rhetoric, you see a lot of mixing. Right? If I think about Donald Trump, there's a lot of anger in it, but also a lot of enthusiasm. Right? I mean, if you elect me, then I can make the country great again. And so, and in such situations, I think actually these mixed emotions, we should think more about them in terms of multiplying rather than sort of evening out.
Yeah.
The arousing effect of anger times enthusiasm is much larger than anger, enthusiasm in isolation.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I really like that. And yeah, so I mean, the question is the relationship to the action tendencies, right? If you're multiplying in ways that where the connection leads to different action tendencies, it's either I should stop and gather more information, for example, or I should plow ahead and really go. That's interesting. The context of a political rally, I think, is a fascinating one. And I think you're right that if you look at something like Donald Trump's rallies, you're going to see both a lot of anger and some building of enthusiasm. And so thinking about the particular combinations is interesting for sure. We've thought a little bit about whether there are different action tendencies within unpleasant or pleasant affective states as well. Josh, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I mean, these are fantastic comments, and I think they just beg a lot. The final conclusion of this paper, which we'll finish today, is going to be one that says this raises a lot more questions than we've answered. Our focus here is on attitude change, and I think that's slightly different than the rally situation, right? What we're trying to do is persuade someone to change their mind. And what we're saying is that if you're in a mixed state, you might be all worked up over something. We're not going to get you to change your mind away from that, is what we're saying. And that's a little different than the rally situation, but certainly you know, the good question that you've asked is, well, how does this apply then there? And I guess my answer is we need more research, because it's a really important question. You know, well, let me just say one thing. I would love to see a study, right, where we were using some of the self-reports and some of these facial EMG type of measures and combining and looking at some of that. I mean, I remember Heist telling me over breakfast at ISPP, right, about some of the cool stuff you guys are doing in tents at rallies and stuff like that. You know, I'd love to see some of that type of additional research that could really push this forward. I will say, just on one final note, that we think that one of the reasons why we like this affect approach is it does require less immediate emotional kind of post hoc awareness and less social desirability bias built in when using self-report emotions. And so, you know, if we gather a bunch of these and we're just trying to place people in a quadrant, an affective quadrant, we think that I have a little more trust in it than asking someone to parse the difference between compassion and sympathy or something like that. So we think there are advantages to this, although, you know, like I said, I'd love to see, you know, how those self-reports match up with
yeah, the only other thing I would add to that, and I just agree with what Josh has said there, is, you know, the other comment that, or the other question that comes to mind from your comment, Heis, is that, you know, maybe the exact location within the quadrant might matter, right? So if you're really, really extreme on, you know, unpleasant and you're feeling just a little bit of pleasant, right? So that might matter. And we've explored that a little bit, and it does seem like that's the case. So exactly where you are in the quadrant might matter, but overall, just being in that mixed quadrant does have the effects that we've described today. So
that's great. We have a question from Matthijs Rodan from the University of Amsterdam. He obviously thanks you for the presentation and says, this is a great project and a very clear presentation. You presented 4 or 5 reasons why scholars often find no effect on attitude change, one of them being problems with the treatment. Your main argument is that there is another reason, mixed affective states. To what extent does what you find also point to problems with the treatment in many studies? After all, you find that there are no average treatment effects. In other words, do your conclusions also imply that people should be more careful when designing their treatments and carefully think about the ways in which they affect different people differently?
That's a great question. Thanks, Matthias. So the short answer is yes, absolutely. So part of the value that we've found, at least for ourselves, in exploring these effects is that it gives us greater clarity about the treatments in a couple of ways, right? So one, we're able to tell the difference between weak and strong treatments. So Josh sort of went quickly through that last table, but in that table, as he pointed out, we can see Shayna's empathy treatment, for example, is a very strong treatment. It did move people from pleasant or into unpleasant and away from pleasant. There's just no question about it. But it also did other things, right? And it didn't fundamentally change the number of people in weak and mixed. The overall aggregate, we can't, because of the design, we can't see individuals exactly, but we can look at the aggregate change. And so we think that gives us clarity. It allows us to see that even in the face of strong treatments, we can still get null effects. We can also see, by the way, in that same table that there were other treatments that were much weaker. one of our original studies, it did what we wanted, but it was a lot weaker than Shayna's treatment, for example, and it got null effects, perhaps for that, partially at least for that reason. But it really drilling in on these affective states gives us some purchase about the mechanism, and thus allows us to think more creatively, we think, about treatments. And we, in addition to thinking about, well, who is in mixed affective states, the other next step for us is to take what we've learned and say, well, what would this imply for designing better treatments? Are there treatments that would move people out of mixed, for example? We're at least able to be a lot more creative and to bring some helpful information to bear as we design those new treatments.
Right, and I would just add, I think you've hit it exactly on the nail on the head, Matthias. I think one of the major benefits, I think, of some of what we've done in the paper, at least as I see it, and I hope others will see it that way, is we can use this as a diagnostic tool, right? So rather than just saying, oh, we get no average treatment effects, it was probably just a weak treatment or it hit the wrong target or something like that. That's the typical, prior to this, we just treated those as a black box, right? And now we're able to say, no, let's break it open. Look, it did hit certain people this way and certain people that way. How might we use this diagnostic tool then to prescribe something better in the second round? And so it gets us away from just talking about strong versus weak, and instead says, you can have a strong treatment with null effects and a weak treatment with null effects. We can now distinguish between the two, and hopefully get some insight on how we can move forward. And I think that's an advantage to this. Now we haven't actually. That's the next series of experiments, is to try and use those insights. And we'd love to see others as well on that.
Okay, great. This is the last question. So I want to thank Josh and Chris for sharing all their cool new projects with us. And thanks for answering all our questions. In the physical lab, this is usually the moment where I hand you over the infamous hot politics coffee mug or tea mug, if you prefer. I can throw them at you, but
send it as an attachment, Gijs.
Unfortunately, they're all in my office, and I can't access it. So it will have to wait at least until June or maybe even September when we're allowed back into the building. Anyway, I owe you 2 coffee mugs to be passed on, hopefully in the not too distant future. Thanks, Chris and Josh. I just want to take a minute to announce the remainder of our program for the next few weeks. Next week, we'll have a slightly different setup where we have 2 PhD students who present the work they were supposed to present at the Midwest Political Science Association meeting. That obviously got canceled. So next week we have Ming Boye from University of Vienna and Melissa Baker from University of South California, I think.
Merced.
Merced, to present their papers. Then the week after that, on May 8th, we have Stephen Riker to present. And then the week after that, on May 15th, we have Gordon Pennycook on Corona and fake news. So all very exciting talks ahead of us, and I hope to see all of you or hear all of you at those meetings as well. For now, enjoy the weekend for the people in the Amsterdam area and for the people in the US. I hope this will be an effective working day without too much interference from your kids.
Thank you so much, Barrett and Gijs. This has just been marvelous for us.
Yeah.
We're very grateful.